Welcome to the podcast Cook and Swig. I'm your host, Swig. We have our guest, Cook. Today, let's talk about the opposite of the Dewey system, classical schooling. What are your thoughts on classical schooling?
Classical schooling is the educational model of Western civilization, growing out of obviously the Christian tradition, and becomes widespread, not just for the learned monks and priests in the church, but becomes widespread after the Protestant Reformation and into the Enlightenment. And so the people that you've heard about in history class, your George Washingtons, John Adams, Thomas Jeffersons in your American history class, grew up with a classical education system. And that there has been a movement to reintroduce classical schools, specifically Christian classical schools. And so the classical school is quite different than the Dewey system in both the way that it expresses itself in, say, a classroom, but also, and probably most importantly, in its aims or its goals. The classical education model is one where students in the classroom seek after truth. They seek after what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And these things are existing outside of the consciousness of the self. They exist in God's reality. And one of the joys of education is discovering those truths. And so that is a sort of an educational model that I would like for my children. It is one that I did not grow up in. And even now in my adult life, I'm lacking to some extent because of that.
So what system is our schooling in general based off of? And would this include Christian schools? Would this include homeschooling? Kind of give the picture today, like who's doing classical schooling and who's doing the Dewey system?
Yeah, so all public schools in the United States, with maybe a few rare exceptions, are under the Dewey model. And we can talk a little bit very briefly as to why I think Dewey would assert this, and it's somewhat sinister. I don't know for sure. I don't think he just comes right out and says it. And then you do have in certain sectors, homeschooling oftentimes will be based on the classical model. It's become more popular since the 1980s and is really experiencing a growth in popularity right now. And also in some Christian schools have embraced classical education.
Why do you think that homeschools are growing now?
Why do I think they are?
Yeah.
For a variety of different reasons. I think that there's been enough of a societal shift over the last 10 years where some things which seem to be inconceivable when I was growing up, for instance, in the 1980s and the 1990s, that are just part of what you see on TV every day, or if you live in Oregon, what you see on the streets. And that has caused a lot of people to back up a bit and say, I don't want my kids in a system that produces that. Combined with the fact that parents heard what was going on in the public school system during COVID, as they heard what was being taught over the Zoom. And so I think a lot of people have kind of reacted towards that.
So what does classical education look like?
In practice, classical education is very different than the Dewey model. As we've talked a little bit about the Dewey model, the purpose, generally speaking, is to both create a product in the student. The student becomes a product of the system itself, almost as if the school system is a factory that produces producers. So that's one of the major goals of it, but also is to promote what they call critical thinking, but critical thinking without any sort of base of knowledge to begin with, which is, I think, one of the reasons why classical schooling is so significantly better. The classical model focuses on what is called the trivium. And the way that this works is that when students are younger, they learn basically facts, but not just cold, hard facts. Oftentimes they learn the facts of a story, or they maybe even memorize the words of a text. Well, they do memorize words of important texts, whether this is poetry from Western literature, poetry from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, words of the New Testament. They memorize things, and oftentimes, depending on if you're looking at a denominational classical model, some of the memorization could also include memorizing words of whatever denomination's catechism is at that particular school. And so the first area of learning here is called the grammar stage, where you learn facts and you memorize. And the way that it kind of usually lands in term, and each student's a bit different, and oftentimes the classical model allows for students to move on when they're ready. And so if you have a fourth grader who's ready, which is very, very unlikely, by the way, to move on to the second stage of the trivium, oftentimes they allow for that. But the early stage is called the grammar stage. The middle stage is called the logic stage, where students will learn about logic and critical thinking and making sense of all those things that they had memorized in the earlier stages of their education in the grammar stage. And then finally, they move into what's called the rhetoric stage. And during the rhetoric stage, not only do they, have they learned how to use logic and make sense of what they've learned, but now they're also able to actively communicate in ways that are intelligent and are very strong for listeners and respectful. And that's called the rhetoric stage. And so this is kind of the model of classical education. And of course, the goal throughout all of this is to make a good, well-rounded, and in the Christian sense, a good, well-rounded, intelligent Christian who not only knows all these things and can communicate well, but also can extrapolate from these things, those things that will help them become stronger and better Christians, or to put it in the words of Jordan Cooper, to help them become more Christified. So it's one of the things that helps them along those lines, is learning about the world and learning about the virtues. And that's in addition to regularly going to church and praying with your family and learning Bible verses together. This is another means of having what the ancients called the good life.
So there was a lot there. I'm actually going to touch on something that maybe some people missed. You talked about people skipping or moving on to different stages above them faster. I've heard of people in the Dewey model, in the public system, skipping grades. Okay, so that does happen, but it seems like you're saying it's a little bit more common. Why not encourage people to stay with their class so that they can continue to form those relationships and mature at the age that everybody else matures at as a unit? Why wouldn't that be desirable?
That is desirable to some extent, but in the classical model, oftentimes the teachers individually within the classroom provide for, to use a modern educational term that no one really does well, differentiation, where the teacher recognizes that the student over here is ready for maybe a little bit more complex of a text, and allows that student to work there. They don't have to be in a different classroom necessarily.
Okay, I see. So they can still be friends with the people of their class and of their grade, but they can have their education a little more personalized and move on. I mean, there are obviously smarter kids than others, and I definitely have seen that in my classroom, that some kids just need to move on and some need to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. And the classical model, historically, before you had like the school systems developed by Horace Mann, and then changed by Dewey, obviously, and then goes all over the entire United States. You had a very personal, you had tutors who would teach kids in this classical model. And of course it was based on the needs of the individual children. The idea of having people locked into grades where you have smart kids who are bored and dumb kids who can't figure out which direction's up, and then the rest in the middle, which is what you're basically teaching to, that's a new problem. That's a problem in the modern schooling system. That's not how it has historically been.
So under that assumption, wouldn't homeschool or individualized tutoring be the best option for everybody? Why have a classical school where you lump them all together anyway?
Good question. Because we are creatures of society. Like we need a group. Humans are social creatures. And it's good for students to grow up with others in their same age, in the same age group, to learn together, to learn how to dialogue with people who are not just their relatives. That's good. And also, oftentimes school is where people will meet their spouses. And if it's a Christian school attached to your church, that's a good thing. And so, because we are social creatures, being in a classical school, I would argue, provided it's done well and it's attached to the appropriate theology, is a great thing. Don't get me wrong, homeschooling is good too. I would argue that because of the social nature of human beings, and this includes also, maybe especially for those who are naturally more, to use a psychological term, introverted, it's good for them to have to be around their fellow humans and learn to interact, because it's more difficult for them to come by that naturally.
And it's good for getting people married, but then you wouldn't have need for dating apps, Mr. Cook.
Thanks be to God.
All right. Well, that's the 10-minute mark. Let's move on to kind of a more historical question. Why would Dewey want to move away from the educational system of not just his state, or not just this really tiny philosophical group of nerds that he's kind of maybe a part of? Why is his goal so vast and universal? Why does he want to destroy the educational system of the West?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to speculate a little bit. I'm not sure that he just lays out all of his reasoning straightforwardly. And that's because I haven't read all of Dewey's works. I was assigned one of Dewey's books in college in my master's program.
Positively?
Yeah, they wanted me. Yeah, yes, very positively. They wanted me to embrace Dewey. And the two things I remember about Dewey is, one, his philosophy of what's called pragmatism just straight up rejects the possibility of truth, which at the time seemed somewhat alarming, and now is, I just straight up reject. And the other thing that sticks with me about Dewey's writing is he's just terribly boring. A philosopher doesn't have to be an interesting writer, but good grief. The guy's literally painful to read.
How did he become popular then?
It was his ideas. It wasn't his writing style. I'll promise you that. But anyway, so let me speculate a little bit as to why Dewey moves in this direction. And I think one of the reasons may be kind of sinister. I think that it was very likely that Dewey had read Nietzsche. Nietzsche had been publishing during the same time as Dewey, and Dewey's educational philosophies became popular in the early 1900s. Nietzsche had looked at the philosophers of the West, and we ought to talk about Nietzsche sometime in the future in a little bit more detail, because in some ways he's a bit of a prophet. But he looks at people like Immanuel Kant, who was, of course, a Western philosopher, very much in favor of a very logically rigorous deontological, ethics system. And Nietzsche just comes along and calls him an idiot and says, don't you see what you've done? You've killed the possibility of God, and you've killed the possibility of truth. And Dewey agreed with that. And so what do you have left? Well, Nietzsche suggests that human beings take the place of God. The idea of God is dead. Human beings take the place of God and become God. And so this is where he has this idea of the Übermensch, right? The superhuman, almost the God human. And that means that humans get to define for themselves truth, at least the smart ones. And then Nietzsche switches and focuses on power. Okay, so if Dewey, I'm sure he was somewhat familiar with Nietzsche, takes this to its logical end, what does that mean for education, the thing that he was interested in? Well, that means that truth doesn't really exist. God doesn't exist. And there's no point in memorizing these things, but power does exist. And this is my speculation, but I think there's probably truth in it. Do we recognize that if we're no longer memorizing and embracing the classic texts of the West that teach truth, goodness, and beauty, and make all that relative, and the only truth that exists for Dewey is something that works in practice, then what that means is whoever's writing the educational books in order to condition the kids, they have all the power, right? And so, if you don't believe me, look at those people who are writing the educational texts today and how that is transforming society and turning the students that have grown up in those educational systems into what you see, on the streets with their signs protesting and Antifa, and the wokish, if you will, the wokish religion of the left is these ideas are new. They don't make a whole bunch of sense, some of them, and yet it's fervently believed. These people who have embraced these things, they don't even know about the Western tradition other than it's bad. And they embrace these new ideas. And behind those ideas, you can see who has power. And so I wonder if Dewey read Nietzsche and conceived of the best way of doing this is through the children, through education. And so that's my speculation. I don't know how true it is, but I would put money on it.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
One, I'll just speak from experience. When I was in high school, I learned that education was, and I lumped, and I think I was taught to lump public education in this. Education is for the purpose of creating good citizens, especially who can think and vote. And you're saying that that could be a purpose of it, but has either changed into be or never really was more of a power game that basically destroys, all objective truth.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm arguing. And that was purposeful on Dewey's part, I think. Whether it was or wasn't, it is what it is now.
I see. So if he wasn't motivated to do that, as sinister as you're thinking, that has been the consequence of it.
Yes, and frankly, I think it probably was. But regardless, that is the consequence. So you say, and yes, this is what I was taught as well. What is the purpose of education? To make, the students good democratic voters. Voting about what? Right? Like behind it, they're telling you and training you and conditioning you to vote for certain things.
So they're saying you should be a good citizen, get out and vote, and then they're slipping in the same exact classroom the laws that you should vote for, how you should think about certain candidates, things like that.
Yeah, or even more broadly, social issues, right? So, marriage is, anything that you call it. Someone can get married, whatever they love, right? So whatever you love, you can get married to, which is, if you think about it from a traditional sense, it's just absurd.
Well, maybe they would put more limits on it. Like, well, maybe marriage is between, any human that loves, another human.
Yeah, but that can go anywhere because there is no truth, right? And so you're seeing how this is transforming, right? So you have a male and a female. Well, there's no truth in that. It's not part of the natural reality. And so then you have something like whatever you think inside of yourself to be is what you are.
Aren't you making a slippery slope fallacy?
No, I'm not. Well, oftentimes a slippery slope turns out to be true. But regardless, I'm saying that logically this makes sense. If you say that there really is no ultimate truth, right, then truth claims become relative, right? And so you say there's a guy with who has all the markings of being male, but if inside he feels he's female, well, then he is. Or if he feels he's a cat, which, by the way, people, you've got furries running around out there. So it's just, I think that this is just kind of the natural outcropping of the educational system. When there's no more truth to be announced, to be known, and everything becomes malleable based upon what you've been conditioned to think is kind of true, at least at the moment, and you're okay with shifting constantly, and you're conditioned to be okay with shifting your positions constantly, then that's the world that you're going to have. And classical education comes along and says, obviously it's already existed previously. No, truth does exist. Goodness does exist. Beauty does exist. These things are objective. They are extranos, Latin, outside of ourselves, and they are to be discovered. And so just come along and reject Dewey's system, because it is, whether it was his intention or not, I think it probably was his intention, it is sinister. So let's not do it.
This is a series where we're talking about classical education, but before we get to that, a listener question. Mr. Cook, in the first episode, you talked about capitalism and how it is truly Marxist. The question was actually more of a critique than anything. This listener said, I'm a capitalist, and I think you can be a capitalist without idolizing money, without pursuing it. How would you respond?
I would say, yeah, and my use of the word Marxist or capitalist was not intended to disparage the use of money. Money can be used in ways that are good and are positive. We give money to the church in our tithes to further the gospel and to sustain our Christian communities. We help the poor. Jesus talks about money. He talks about wise stewardship. So the comment was not meant to disparage the use of money. Money can be a bad thing, though, in the sense that if you love it, right, the love of money, the Bible says, is the root of all evil. And in a capitalist or a Marxist worldview, the focus on economics is really the basis for human interaction. And that focus is wrong. Money should not be the focus of our interactions, but rather money is a useful tool. So I did not mean to disparage the use of the tool of money. My point was that in systems where, whether it's capitalistic or Marxist, if your only focus is on, achieving money and financial success and wealth for yourself, that's not the purpose of life. On your deathbed, no one says, gosh, I wish I made a little bit more money. That would have been really good. No, what do they think about? They think about their family. They think about, eternity. But they're not usually concerned with, gosh, I just wish I made a little bit more money. That would have been awesome. And so that's what I mean by Marxist, capitalist. When you make money the center of your life, that's a problem. And that's all I was meaning by that.
So Marx has two philosophies. He has a philosophy that we are primarily economic beings. And within that, he has another philosophy about how we should function economically. And that would be maybe more of the Marxist system. But then also capitalism could fit under that first Marxist philosophy and assert that we are economic beings, just with a different way of producing, an economy kind of thing.
Absolutely correct. And, in terms of what works better for humanity in helping to provide our necessities in living this life, you have kind of the socialist answer of Marx, or the capitalist answer, which talks about, private ownership. And I would say, typically capitalism works better, or not even typically, just does.
So
it has all sorts of practical benefits that are good. And I don't mean to disparage those at all. Good things such as, competition in the capitalistic system tends to make things efficient. You have to be efficient in order to be successful. And so efficiency makes life better because we can spend more time focusing on the things that are important. The question is that what we're doing? Are we focusing on the things that are important? Quality oftentimes is improved where there's competition. And oftentimes prices can be lowered as well because businesses are in competition with each other. So there are benefits. I'm not trying to disparage capitalism itself at all. It's just when you make the functioning of it at all, just when you conceive of human interaction and human purposes in terms of economics, you're missing it. That's my point.
I do want to get on to classical education, but one more question. Christians in Acts 2 had everything in common. Sounds like Christians are called to be in some sort of socialist relationship with each other when it comes to money.
Yeah, well, maybe. Just because they did it that way doesn't mean that you necessarily have to, although I think it's probably perfectly fine. I would argue that Christians should live in communities where they do look after each other.
So kind of a local
even though
Christian
that's not
communism.
Well, I wouldn't use the word communism there because it has all sorts of baggage that doesn't need to be attached to it.
I guess Christian communism is kind of doesn't work anyway.
Yeah, no. So let's say Christian communities where there's like legitimate care for one another. Yeah, that.
All right. All right. Let's move on to classical schools in hopefully our last episode in this series. I want to talk about an important aspect of classical schooling, and that's this idea of kind of that middle transcendental. And just for those of you that don't know, the transcendental is truth, goodness, and beauty. Classical schools focus on goodness in the form of virtue. So, Mr. Cook, what is virtue, and how do classical schools foster it, and why do they foster it?
Yeah, good question. And before I address this, what are the virtues? They typically are broken up into two groups. We'll talk about those, and then how does classical education teach those virtues? Wonderful stuff. But before we jump into that, I have been told that some of our listeners are evangelicals, and oftentimes there's this mixing of theology within evangelicalism that makes life treacherously difficult. And I don't want the discussion here of virtues to be lumped into the answering the question, how am I saved?
Okay.
In evangelicalism, I've noticed oftentimes if someone feels like they aren't being good enough, or if they are when I was a kid, the word was backsliding. Maybe that's still the word that's used. Am I backsliding? Am I not being a good enough Christian? Do I need to rededicate myself to Jesus in order for me to, be a Christian again? And there's all this angst. And then also there's potentially some pride that could go with that as well when you feel like you're doing well. Right, you say, "Oh, look at this! I'm, being a good Christian. I'm living these virtues well. Go me." And the purpose of the virtues here is none of that. It's not attached to your salvation at all. The purpose of the virtues are for living living the happy Christian life here. It's not about whether God loves you, and it's not about whether you're going to heaven or not. We are justified freely by God's grace, but virtues are still very, and you're still alive on this earth, and you need to live here. And it would be good if you can live well. And so that's what the virtues are for. Therefore, you becoming that person that you were created to be, not perfectly on this side of heaven or on this side of the resurrection, but to maximize your humanity in the best sense of the term on this earth. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about virtues for good living, for the good life, not so that you can earn your salvation or that you can, check to see whether or not you're backsliding enough that they require a rededication or something.
Let's get into talking about what these are, because I don't even think people have a framework these days for the concept of virtue.
Agreed. Turn on the television, the news for 5 seconds, and you'll see virtue is not even a thought.
And we're not saying, like, what you're not saying is people don't care about what's right and wrong. So there is a difference here. People do care about what's right and wrong, but there's still this kind of category of virtue that is not, strict. This is right. It's right to, not get an abortion or something. And that's exactly what virtue is. And those are different, but I don't think people have the category of virtue. So let's start to build that.
Yeah. And that's a very good point. People have a moral sense. People on the far right, even the extreme, like right-wing Nazis, they have a strong moral sense. They think they're right in their right-wing extremism, and the people on the left think that they're right in their left-wing extremism. There's definitely a moral sense just sort of in humanity, but within this, the idea of virtue is largely lost. I haven't read all of it, but I've read some of it. Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue is definitely worth taking a look at. And he kind of talks about what happens with morality. And you and I could even talk about how does virtue become somewhat lost in the Western world, not just because of Dewey, but even back before that, you have other philosophers and even a theologian who I think is largely to blame for the loss of the idea of virtue ethics. And I'll just say his name here really quickly.
Kierkegaard?
No, long before Kierkegaard.
Oh, okay.
Although Kierkegaard has issues as well. I think it's John Calvin. I think you can go back to Calvinist theology and see sort of the disconnect from the idea of Christian virtue ethics.
We just lost half our listener base, but for the rest of you that are here, so why would Calvin be one to ruin?
I think that's a really good question, and we should write it down and address it later.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so virtue is kind of not really focused on that much. So we've talked about the purpose of virtue. The purpose of virtue is not for your salvation, but it's for you to have the good life. And the virtues that are taught in classical education include what are known as the cardinal virtues and what are known as the theological virtues. The cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice.
Okay, put those in American for me.
Yes, I will. I will. So prudence is another way of saying wisdom. Do you have the ability to look at a situation and to see what smart, wise, long-term results of actions will be, right? And the same thing when it comes to interacting with other human beings. Are you a prudent person in the way that you discern the way you interact? So think of it in terms of wisdom. Are you a wise person? And in case you're saying, well, gosh, I'm not a wise person, or I could use a little bit of that. Well, the good news about virtue ethics is that it's essentially a system where you grow, right? Virtues are practiced. They're not automatically perfect. It's not a formula like some sort of deontological ethical system, right? A deontological ethical system by, say, Immanuel Kant would say, you follow the categorical imperatives.
That's gonna
Or Bentham would say, you calculate out the consequences using pleasure as your as your calculator. No, it doesn't do that. It says you practice virtue. And so you practice wisdom, and over time you get better at it. And if you are a wise person, you won't just be basing it upon your own experiences. You'll be looking at how other people have lived their lives and learning from that. How have other wise people acted? How have foolish people acted? Can I go through the other cardinal virtues really quickly here?
Sure. And I'll circle back. I definitely have some questions about prudence.
Okay. Temperance is not, thou shalt not ever drink alcohol. Rather, temperance is the pleasure should be done in moderation. If it's a good pleasure, you can overdo it. Don't, right?
And the reason why you bring up the alcohol example is because there was actually a political movement called the temperance movement, which
Correct.
actually for a short time, alcohol was illegal to make and sell.
And consume.
And it was called and consume, and it was called the temperance movement. So you're saying that that's completely wrong way of looking at temperance.
Yeah. Kind of, that's to kind of ruin that virtue for us, I guess, because but really it just means moderation, right? Moderation in the pleasures, and that doesn't mean moderation in everything, right? You shouldn't moderately cheat on your wife. Okay, only sometimes. You should never cheat on your wife, but but things like pleasure, like eating, you should only eat a moderate portion. Don't starve yourself. That won't lead to a healthy lifestyle. And yes, that is a problem. And don't overeat. Gluttony, that's also a problem.
And these are at a certain point, this I know maybe I'm looking at it too black and white, but the virtues are a matter of sin and righteous living. But the tricky part is it's not as black and white. And so
Correct.
It's more like maybe degrees of sin or degrees of righteousness. Is that maybe a good way to look at it?
Well, it's kind of, although virtue would lie in the mean, right? So not eating any food is bad for you, and eating too much food is bad for you. They're both bad.
But you're going to have the people with the Protestant mindset of guilt. They're going to feel guilty if they're not being perfectly wise in a situation. They're going to feel guilty if, for those who really do care about their, kind of puritanical evangelicalism, they're going to feel guilty if they're not being perfectly moderate.
And that can be, I suppose, if you use that wisely, that guilt, that can encourage you next time to be more moderate and to pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing. But then again, you have to be very careful not to fall back into the, oh my goodness, I've done badly here. I've backslidden. And then you're looking at virtues all wrong. The virtues here are to help you live well, and to become a better person, and frankly, a better Christian. But I think there's been this confusion between justification and sanctification in lots of Protestantism that says, well, if you're sinning here, if you've gone off balance here with the virtues one time, well, then you got major problems. Well, you do have a problem. It's called you have a sin nature, but pick yourself up and keep walking towards the good life. It's virtue is learned.
So we shouldn't be anxious about not being virtuous, at least completely virtuous.
Correct. Yeah. You should be anxious in some way over your sin and turn in repentance to God and realize He loves you. But in terms of healthy living, pick yourself up and continue to work at the virtues.
Okay.
And that would be temperance. Fortitude, or another way of thinking about it, is courage, or maybe a stick-to-itiveness is another virtue, which is something that I think a lot of us today lack. It's not really emphasized a whole bunch. And then finally, justice. How do we live in a world that's just, in the sense that it treats people fairly? So think of just fairness. How do you treat, and most importantly, not just in terms of law, which is good if the laws are just,
But sometimes
In
they're
fact,
not.
and lots of times they're not. But more practically, where you live, are you just? Are you behaving justly towards your neighbor? Are you behaving justly towards your spouse, your children? And when you look at those things, you'll say, gosh, there are some times when I'm not, and I need to work on that. And those are the cardinal virtues. And the reason they're called cardinal virtues is because they're not explicitly and only taught in the Bible. Okay, they are taught in the Bible, but they're not only taught in the Bible. You can find these virtues in all societies at all times. It's just part of human nature. And then it's a part of nature, I should say. And then there's the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the greatest of these is love. And so these are the virtues that teach us how to live well. And these things are not, again, to go back to Rousseau, these things aren't true because I internalize them and make them true. These things are objectively true. And I should, as a human being, seek to live those out. And this is not taught in John Dewey's system at all. The idea of virtue is gone. The idea that any of these things are like objectively good is gone. But these things can still be found in classical education.
Maybe something I'm thinking about too is kind of a difference between temperance and fortitude is if something is an objective good that's just always good no matter what, maybe fortitude is the thing that you need when sticking to it. So, being selfless in your sacrifice, that requires fortitude. You don't want to have temperance in your selflessness. But
Right.
then when it comes to things that could become bad, that's where you need to, they're good, they're gifts from God, but they become bad. That's maybe more where you need something like temperance.
Yeah. And so, in virtue language, we call it a vice, right? So you need temperance, drunkenness, becoming a drunkard is a vice. It's not a good thing.
So would video games be in the fortitude section where I just need to keep going until I finish the campaign?
Yeah, probably not. Not to say that there wouldn't be some times where that might be appropriate to play a video game for a while. Yeah, sure. But if that becomes your obsession, then absolutely not. That becomes a vice.
It's not an obsession until it extends past 5 or 6 hours a day. So I think most of our listeners are probably fine.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, provided you don't go past 6 hours a day, neglecting food, water, and relationships. You can do that for 5 hours a day. Neglect all those things for 5 hours a day, and you're good to go.
All right. Let's move on to how, unless you wanted to say more about that, can we talk about how classical schools foster these?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, it's nice to talk about these things in theory, but what does it look like practically? Mm-hmm. Rather than disparaging the Western tradition and culture and literature, classical education embraces it, and it embraces things even to pre-Christian writings. Herodotus is read in a classical setting. Plato is read in a classical setting. Homer, is read in a classical setting, and these things are appreciated whether they're Christian or not. And so when kids are little in the grammar stage, oftentimes they'll memorize things. They'll become very familiar with stories and they'll memorize important texts. And so,
and a remnant of that would be like The Boy Who Cried Wolf.
Yes, exactly. The Boy Who Cried Wolf would be one of those stories that teaches a moral lesson, right? In the story, The Boy Who Cries Wolf, we realize that if you are dishonest and you are claiming that there is some sort of emergency, enough times people will stop believing you. And then when there really is an emergency, well, the wolf eats you. Other stories, Aesop's fables are good places to go for some of these moral lessons. And these are old. The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg is a story that teaches about greed and how greed is a vice. And so you have a man and his wife who have a goose, and little kids learn this. And these things used to be everywhere in our culture, even after John Dewey's education system really took over in the 1930s. These stories stuck around for a while. They're pretty well dead now, unless you are actively teaching these things to your kids. But you could talk to your grandparents, and I guarantee you all of them know these stories. Okay, your grandparents know these stories because they stuck around for a while. The goose who laid the golden egg. A man and his wife are fortunate to have a goose that lays golden eggs, and they become greedy. They don't want just the daily golden egg. Instead, they must figure that the goose's belly is all made of gold. So they think if they kill the goose and rip into its belly, they'll find a whole bunch of gold there since it lays golden eggs. And what do? They rip into the goose's belly and find it's just a regular goose that, fortunately for them, at least for a time, laid golden eggs, and now they don't have that income. And so, yeah, don't be greedy.
That's really interesting that you say that these stories have lasted, because they're classical education stories properly.
Oh, yeah.
But they've lasted into the Dewey system, into the public school system. And you're right. Like I talk about these stories. I've talked about just a few of them that I even learned growing up. Maybe my grandpa used to tell me the story of Briar Bear and Briar Fox, and I don't think any of them, any of the freshmen or any of the high schoolers would know what that is. Let alone, some of them probably wouldn't even know about the boy who cried wolf, and most of them wouldn't know about the goose that laid the golden egg. So
yeah, you're right. And I would say that in my experience teaching for the last 14 years, this was a pretty dramatic change. In teaching APUS history, I would teach about kind of slave culture, and I'd give the story of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. And early on, most of the kids knew the story, and by the end, none of them did. Yeah, and so these stories have really, really died out. And so, yeah, so teach you to be be wise. And then so when kids are a little bit older, they'll read stories like the Odyssey by, it was a grand poem by Homer. And what is that story about? It's about Odysseus after the capture of Troy, after the fall of Troy, rather. He's in prison, and the gods set him free. And now he wants to go home. And the whole story is about him getting home. And on the way, he is tempted by all sorts of different things. And what the story teaches consistently throughout is fortitude, right? It's hard for Odysseus to get home. He could easily give up. There's a whole variety of different challenges, from the Cyclops, which is violent, to the Sirens, which call him for sexual promiscuity. And no, he remains true to his wife and goes home to her. And so you learn virtues in both the great poetry, and then frankly, even the Bible. And I know this is just kind of tragic, but in the Christian schooling that I've seen, the Bible isn't referenced very much. Even the Old Testament stories aren't referenced very much. And there's virtues to be learned in the Old Testament. You have the story of David, a famous story of him looking out and seeing Bathsheba and deciding that he wants to have her. And then so not only does he seek to sexually have her, which he does, and commits adultery, but he goes from there and then has her husband essentially killed. And so what David did was not wise, was not just. And we can see David's actions as wrong. He fell from being the virtuous person that he needed to be. He violated God's commandment, the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. He did not lead a chaste and decent life. He did not honor his spouse or the spouse, of Bathsheba by sleeping with her. And so we can learn virtues from all of these stories, whether they're in the Bible or whether they are in just the Western canon.
Something that I like to focus on in my Old Testament class is how David, foreshadows Christ and how he is the king that is kind of this example of the true king that comes ultimately much later, but is a son of David. But you're saying even before that, that would be maybe more of a logic stage or a rhetoric stage conversation. But even before that, the grammar stage, just memorize the story of David and Bathsheba and how what he did was bad and how his repentance was good. Just as simple as that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and try getting away with that in a Dewey school. It's not going to work. But in traditional Western education, that's exactly how it works. And so that is the type of educational system I want for my children. I'm very concerned in a world that has forgotten the virtues and has almost made a virtue out of the vices. A world where the good has become bad. How do you raise a child in this?
I was just going to ask that. How, if these stories have been so pivotal to Western civilization and have even lasted, 60 or 80 years into the Dewey system, or however long we've been plagued by his system, what has replaced them? Because if even in the last 14 years, you've seen a decline in these stories, is there something that's replaced? I feel like you can't just have a vacuum of stories as a child. You have to believe in some story, right?
Oh, absolutely. Human beings are by nature, whether we want to notice it or not. But I think that even the most secular person would acknowledge that human beings are attracted to story. We just love stories. We are creatures of story. We look at our own lives and we think of it, whether again we're secular or religious, we think of our own lives in terms of a story, the story of my life. And so what stories are replacing these stories? Well, they exist. And the stories that have replaced these old ones, these old fables, or these old stories from the Bible, or these old stories from Greek literature, you can find on Disney Plus, and you can find them on Netflix. And you notice that most of them are virtueless in the traditional sense of the word virtue.
So grandfathers aren't the ones telling the stories anymore. It's companies.
Correct. Yeah. In fact, if we want to talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we could talk about potentially, Rousseau and Nietzsche and maybe Freud or Marx. But if there's a fifth one, maybe it's Walt Disney.
And those are the new Aesop's fables, which actually are connected to some of them. So maybe Pinocchio would maybe be an old story that's kind of
absolutely
been Disneyfied.
Absolutely. Although it's all the story of Pinocchio is altered in the 1941 Walt Disney edition to some extent, much of the moral remains there. And it's a movie you should show your children. It comes across, it's kind of disturbing actually.
Yeah.
But it's a good one. Frozen, which I have had the misfortune of watching, is it's abysmal. It has no conception of anything in the West. It's painful, and it teaches feminism. It teaches even some occultish things subversively in ancient Norse religion, pre-Christian Norse religion.
But those things, the kids don't recognize those things as Norse religion and then end up growing up and believing them.
No. And so the main concern there would not be the Norse religion business, but it is in there, and it's normalizing other religious traditions, or that all religions have merit. That's probably.
I see what you mean. And
that's subtly taught and it's subtly bought. And so, is that the sort of thing is that the sort of story that we should be teaching to our children? Well, you could teach them that, or you could teach them, the Odyssey, or you could teach them about King David or about King Solomon.
But they're going to
teach them about Elijah and Ahab, right? There are stories to be had that are good, that teach good things. And what's being taught in these modern stories. And then, if you want the adult version, then turn to Netflix and you can see, oh, what's that one about the guy who's like a serial killer and he loves the girl? And
Oh, you?
yeah, my gosh, I tried to watch a little bit of that, and it's just morally bankrupt. It normalizes that sort of thinking, which is wrong on every level. It normalizes to some extent. Now, I think deep down we sort of are horrified by it, but also fascinated by it. But the way that it presents it is from his perspective. And, what are we doing? That's a waste of time. Let's focus on the good things. Let's focus on the good.
So
What teaches us the good things.
what you're talking about here is a whole restructuring of how we even intake, whatever stories. So you're saying that even media itself as a medium kind of has this slippery slope towards not focusing on the virtues, and books and stories that are passed on from grandfathers orally have kind of an intrinsic value to them. Is that kind of something I'm
hearing? In fact, let me wrap back around to our very first point a while ago, may have even been in our last discussion. And that is that purposefully on the part of educators, their desire from the Deweyites, their desire is to be able to so-called, make citizens of democracies agents of social change. Well, how do you make them agents of social change if you want to change things? First thing you have to do is get rid of the old permanent stuff, the old permanent virtues, the old permanent truths, the old permanent goodnesses, and the old beautiful things, right? Get rid of that first. And largely, as you and I are talking about, it's in our culture, it's gone. No one knows any of the stories anymore, or very few of them. It's gone. And so now you can educate people through media, through the public school system, to embrace these new ideas. And since the people that are being conditioned have no knowledge of what was previous because they've never been taught it and have never encountered it, now they're much easier to change and to warp. And so you see radical social change in the United States in the last 10 years. Well, how does that happen? How do you get such radical change? And not just, maybe politically with a Donald Trump or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like the social change. You do it by getting rid of the old stuff that used to be permanent for hundreds or thousands of years. And now you are open to complete conditioning.
Shouldn't we have some sort of comfortability with us being different than our grandparents? I mean, I've heard the quote, it's 2020, it's not 1847, whenever I've talked about, not having a TV or not having Instagram. Where's the modernity? I don't hear you see anything positive in modernity.
Oh, well, first, let me say there's much that is positive that's come about because of things like the Industrial Revolution. If we are being wise about it, if we're being prudent, if we're being temperate about the uses of these things, right? So if we were, in other words, if we're actually using the virtues in some of these advances, then some of these things can be fine, right? So the washing machine. Typically, the woman of the house would spend one day or more a week washing clothes, all day scrubbing clothes. Well, now, guess what? She doesn't have to spend the entire day doing that. You throw them in the washing machine and almost forget about it.
And that's a good thing.
And that's a good thing. If you take the time that you now have that you didn't have before, and you properly orient it towards good things, right? So if now you're spending time doing, say that the washing in a particular family is done by the woman, if she's orienting her free time now towards a good thing, her other vocations that are more important than clothes washer, if that's part of their family, right? Which is mother or wife, right? And or worker at the church. She works in the church. She helps with the church for whatever, whether it's, secretarial work or whatever she does, right? Practicing for the organ because she's the organist. Great. Or is she, on Amazon spending money, right? Is she ignoring her children? Well, that's no better than washing clothes. Is she ignoring the church, right? So it depends on how you use the benefits of modernity.
Well, you're listening to Cook and Swig. We have all of the critiques of modernity on here. We'll see you guys next time.